Hello, welcome to week 4 of PSHS 6240. So we're going to talk about two topics today, actually three. The terrorist-related topics are going to be about terrorist adaptation based on the readings and the case studies you guys read about. And the second will be WMD terrorism based on the Om Shinrikyo case study that I had you read. Before I get to those two topics, I'm going to actually spend the first 20 minutes of class doing a how to do PowerPoint slides. And it's not how to do PowerPoint, but it's how to make your slides more engaging, visually appealing for not only just this class, but for your career and your future presentations as well. This is one of those topics where people think they know what they're doing, but they really don't. I would tell you that 80% of presentations are horrible and don't convey to an audience because the slides are too dense, too wordy, etc. So I want to get that out to you for the first 20, 30 minutes of class. Second part of class, again, is going to be terrorism adaptation. And what we're going to go through is a model of how terrorists adapt to how terrorists adapt, how they respond to counter-terrorist actions, and whether they succeed or fail. And starting right up, I'm going to call on you randomly, based on your discussion posts, and actually explain your case study. And in your case study, I want you to explain how the group, what was the initial issue surrounding the group, how did they adapt, if they did adapt, how did they respond to the counterterrorism actions, and why were they successful or why were they not successful? What were the factors that led to their eventual success, like Hezbollah, or demise, like Jamaat Islamiyah, the Earth Liberation Front? So we'll cover that in detail. For the radicalization cycle, what we're going to do is talk in detail on how this blueprint, and I've done some work on this, but how this blueprint applies to terrorist adaptation. And I'll go through a several-step process. The first step will be the initial fissure. This is the reason why the terrorist group exists. There's either a political issue, there's ethnic violence, there might be some sort of other problem, and you've explored those in your readings, but this is the reason why the group comes to about. And then they start to engage in some sort of violent act, a terrorist act. That act might be focused against the government military, their police forces, maybe sometimes their civilian work. For the most part, this act is seen as legitimate, a legitimate response to the oppressive parts of a government or another entity. So that's step 2. Then step 3 is you start to see fissures in an organization, and this determines whether the organization succeeds or fails. And the fissures tend to go along with whether they want to increase terrorist activity or try and use the terrorist activity to establish some political bona fides. And this is where you kind of see tension in the group. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for the most part, terrorist organizations take the route of the violent extremists. Violence breeds violence, which breeds violence. And in this case, or in several cases that I'll talk about, you see that, where in order to prove their bona fides, a group will engage in more violence. And leaders, in order to rise, will engage in violence, and they will outdo each other to be the more violent of the group. And suddenly you see these fissures start to exacerbate further, where an element wants to be involved in some sort of political process, but then there's a larger element that just wants to engage in violence for the sake of violence. And then this is exacerbated when new leaders come up and other leaders are killed, and new leaders want to be more violent, and then new leaders become even more violent and they're less charismatic. So that fissures start to break, and then the organization turns towards radicalism. So they might have had some legitimate political grievance at one time, but the group spins towards its own demise by just being too violent, and then violence for the sake of violence, and it becomes too brutal. the overall political cause is lost, and they're switched to a level of irrelevancy. So we'll use 3 cases, not from your reading, that explain this. The first is the Sikh separatist movement. In India, the Sikh separatists, Sikh religion is known for their turbans. Sikhs were part of a small religion, part of the larger Hindu religion in India. And you see this. There's initial fissure. There was some oppression of the Sikhs, legitimate. They engaged in some terrorism violence against the Indian security forces. But then to kind of one-up each other in the violence game, they turned to become more violent. They focused on civilians. They focused on assassinations, killing Indira Gandhi. And then they focused on Air India Flight 185. That was the violent escapade that led to the undermining of the organization, loss of legitimacy. And that the organization continued to radicalize, and they spun into irrelevancy. The second is Algeria. Again, you had initial fissure where the Algerian government took control after an election. The resistance, the armed Islamic group, engaged in violence against the Algerian government, arguably legitimate, depending on your interpretation. But then fissures started to break up where the violence led to a case of its own, and violent, even criminal figures started to take control of the organization, and they engaged in violence to try and advance in that organization, and they became more violent and more violent and more violent. And the organization went from its legitimate political goals towards radicalism, towards irrelevancy. And the third is the Sons of Iraq. This is a little bit of a different case study because they in Iraq, they split off from Al-Qaeda in 2007. That's why the insurgency kind of went down. But then they came back up again with ISIS. But now you're seeing that ISIS, again, there might have been some legitimate grievance for ISIS. Oppression of the Sunnis by Iraq and by Syria, and that led to ISIS. But then you see them, again, as new targets come about, you see where criminal elements take the group, and then ISIS turns itself to irrelevancy. So these are the kind of the adaptation, and I want you to talk about your group and how it fits into this kind of adaptation cycle. So the third part, again, is talk about WMD terrorism, the only existential threat of terrorism going forward. We'll talk about, we'll give a quick WMD 101. What is chemical weapons? What are biological weapons? Most of you probably know this, but just to get everyone on the same kind of sheet of music. So what is chemical? What is biological weapons? How could a terrorist use it? Then we'll talk about the discussion section. Why Al-Qaeda was not able to use it, or ISIS not able to use it on a larger scale, but Shinrikyo did. And that'll be a big part of your paper for this week. And then we'll go into the 2 case studies, Shinrikyo, which you read about, and the Rajneeshi case study, which you didn't read about, which is a biological attack in the United States that has been lost to history a little bit. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. So that covers week 4, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class this week.